So art 2, this is my previously done example with a couple different types of trees, and I'm just going to do another example of this type, something similar to that, and another example of some of the evergreens, and I'll also do another layer on top of these ones. Because there is no real right or wrong way to do the trees. There's a lot of different types of trees. There's lots of different amounts of detail that you can use. So as trees are further away, they're going to be less detailed. So then the trees that are closer and closer would be more and more detailed. The first thing you would want to do, no matter what type of tree you're drawing, is some sort of preliminary drawing. So you can see on this particular example, I've done the line work very, very lightly. I've focused a little bit more on the trunk because up here, I'm going to primarily have leaves. So I'm not too concerned about getting all of the branches for this entire portion drawn in there. I'm more concerned about sort of the suggestion of it. So then I would make sure I'm looking at an example on my computer. Again, you can look up examples of watercolor trees specifically. You can also look up photographs of real trees. You can look up actual landscapes and be working from that. But I do want to go ahead and get my green wet. I'm also going to get my brown good and wet, and my black. My blue is already wet. You will actually surprisingly use blue in shadows on your trees a lot, especially for winter themes. Just because there's a lot of cool colors in winter. So now I'm just going to start in on that trunk. Pretty much no matter what kind of tree you do, you are going to start with the trunk. And what you want to do is look for which parts of the trunk are darkest, and that's where you want to put that first layer. So notice that just like when we were shading with a pencil, I'm not just jumping right in with my darkest value. I'm putting sort of just a preliminary sort of brown in those areas. Now on these little itty bitty branches, I'm probably only going to do one layer, and I am barely pressing down at all with my paintbrush. Pressing down a little bit more at the base where it connects to the trunk, and then less and less as I move up. So now that might be sort of my first layer on that particular tree. I think you can still see the whole tree there. So now I'm just going to put a little blue in my shadow while it's still wet, so that I get some of that wet on wet. So now I'm just darkening some of those shadow areas, mostly just in the trunk. And then I'm going to dry off my brush a bit to sort of blend it out so that I don't end up with too harsh of a line. There will be some lines and roots and things like that. And then there's going to be areas where you want to make sure you don't put any paint, because once again, those are highlights on your tree. And for now, we just want to leave those completely white. So at this point, the tree definitely is going to have a little more blue on it than what it will by the very end. But that's okay, because we can always lift more of that blue out. We can also add more layers. We can add an orange to the blue, because remember, complementary colors will make a brown. You could also use purple in the shadows. I tend to prefer blue, personally, for the shadows of my tree trunks. That does not mean that it's right, does not mean that it's wrong. It's really about preference. So here I'm just looking at my example, continuing to darken sort of the shadow side of the tree while the paint is drying. Because if I go ahead and continue working in it while it's drying, then I'm going to have a stronger chance of making sure that I get smooth lines and then my colors are blending. So right now I'm just kind of lifting this edge so that I don't get a harsh line on both sides. Adding some more of the detail of the trunk in here, using the lifting as well, lightening some areas, allowing other areas to remain darker. It's okay, especially on something like a tree, if some of the texture from your paint shows. Because tree trunks do have texture to them. So it's perfectly fine if yours does. So here I'm just adding layer after layer. I'm lightening as I go, kind of lifting, softening edges that I don't want there to be firm lines, and leaving the edges that I do want to be more firm. Because I'm not going to go into any branches on this particular tree until the trunk is dry. Or at least until I'm not going to go in on leaves. Sorry, I'm obviously working on the branches. But I'm not going to go in with any leaves until these branches are at least mostly dry, so that when I go over it with my leaf layers, I'm not obfuscating the branches. I want the branches to still be able to show, kind of like they do on this example, where you can see some of the branches a little bit through some of those leaves. Sorry, back to this one. So now I'm going to let that dry a little bit, and I'm going to go ahead and move to my evergreen example that's over here in the middle. And I'm going to go ahead and start once again with my trunk. It's not going to be as solid as this particular trunk because it's really under a lot more. And we can always go back and darken the bottom of the trunk where we see it. Pressing down less and less again as I move up towards that sort of tip area. I am going to go ahead and put a little bit of blue in here, just to give myself a little bit of shadow under here. And I am going to lift a little bit. Now there are some evergreen type trees that do have a lot of branches, like some of the other trees that are on here. You can get as much detail with the branches as you want. More detail, less detail is completely up to you. These videos are just showing you a couple of ideas for how you could achieve the effect you want. The biggest thing is to experiment and to realize and remember that there is no real right or wrong way to doing most of a watercolor painting. You just want to make sure that you get used to the material and start to learn how to let the watercolor kind of do its own thing. So now that trunk might be ready for me to go over with my actual tree portion. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and get my brush in some good green, and I'm going to just start. This is actually a blob. Okay, you don't want it to be a blob on the tip. There was a blob there, but I'm going to start at the very, very top and just make kind of like a couple little marks, and then work my way down, getting wider and wider, and adding a little bit of water as I go, because I don't want any of this to dry yet, because right now some of those marks are a little bit more defined than I want them to be. Just adding more water to help things spread out. Notice too that you're not too worried about exact detail, shadows, and highlights. You do want to make sure you're looking at your reference image and figuring out if there is a specific darker or lighter side to your tree, but you also don't want to necessarily be so focused on just one side of it being light versus dark, that you get no variety in the rest of the tree there. So now I'm going to go in with a little bit of blue, especially up towards the very top. Again, still just wet on wet. And I'm going to soften some of those areas as well. At the top, it's just a little bit darker than I want it to be. So I'm just going to gently put a paper towel on it. And that's just going to lift some of it up. So that it gets a little bit more of the or the value that I want it to be. And I'm just going to continue going through. Because similarly to how I was working on the trunk on the other tree, you will continue to work into this at varying stages of dryness. And you can absolutely still use the lifting technique on trees as well. Just remember once again that anywhere where you can see through the branches or you've got white within that tree, no matter what kind of tree it is, you're going to want to leave the paper white. Now I can also add a little bit of texture here by wadding with my paper towel and just sponging a bit. So that's one thing that you can do on trees, because some trees do just have a little more texture than they have branches or leaves. And you can use this technique. It will blot up and dry up some of your color so that you can do another layer a little bit sooner, but it will also create some texture on that tree for you. So I would let that dry before I added any more to it. And then once it is dry, I would look more closely at where the shadows and the highlights go, where I need to change things up a little bit. And you can see that this tree appears closer than these trees because I did make sure that I left those lines a little bit harder. To make them a little softer, you would just use more water and less pigment. So the next video that I'm going to show you is going to start on the leaves here, but then I'm also going to do a second layer of the leaves on this tree, and then we'll see how dry this is by that point.